And welcome to Wachari Nation Building Monday Live. I am Ifashina Efuniemi, and it is my pleasure always to be with you on this Monday evening as we discuss nation building. And tonight I have with me for a second time Baba Roy Caetano, who we know is a gold mine of knowledge on Garifuna culture, Garifuna history. And as we had started our discussion last week, or focused our discussion last week, we had mentioned these things before, but we focused our discussion last week on Garifuna land use and by extension, our rights to our lands that we've occupied here in Belize. And Baba Roy will be sharing his own knowledge and experience as it relates to our lands here in this country, lands that we have occupied in this land that is now called Belize. Garinagu, as I had shared last week in terms of the history, have been in Belize since 1802, as documented. Since 1802, they were a group of 150 was approved to come to work in logging camps, mahogany works, as they were referred to at that time. And that is what started the then consistent migration of Garinagu from Honduras to what is now Belize. And at the time, the Garinagu who came, those first settlers, were essentially restricted to occupying the southern portion of this country, which is that area below the Saboon River. And as I had explained last week, it was such that the settlers were uncomfortable with having this group of free Afro descendants associating or being in the same spaces with their enslaved Afro descendants. So what they decided to do was have us then settle to the south of the Saboon, and also we would have restrictions in terms of being in what was then called Belize Town. So essentially, we were occupying what you could say was a no man's land in terms of it was not occupied, not even by the Spaniards, who, according to the agreements and treaties that had been signed up to that point, were the ones that had jurisdiction over these lands. They did not certainly occupy the southern coast of Belize. And even the indigenous population of this country, being the Mayas, they also were not occupying the southern coast of this country. It was, in fact, the Garinagu that occupied the southern coast below Saboon to the Sarstoon and occupied it undisturbed for many years, as a matter of fact. And so in our occupation of those lands, we farmed and we fished and we grew our communities. We set up our structures to dwell in. We set up our spiritual spaces. We had economic activity that we engaged in, not just for ourselves, but also traded with other areas of the country. So we were, in fact, an essential component of the economic development of this nation. And so it is on that backdrop, that history, that we proceeded with the discussion last week and that we will be continuing the discussion this week. Because in this time, at this current time, we face challenges in our communities as it regards to these very lands that prior to our arrival were not being utilized in what is now called Belize. And so I welcome Baba Roy's insights, as like I've mentioned, and as we all know, he is very knowledgeable of our history. and of our development and our contributions to this country's development that is called Belize. So Baba Roy, welcome to Wachari Nation Building Monday Live. I'm looking forward, and I'm sure our viewers are also looking forward to your insights on this issue that is right now on the front burner for us as Garifuna. Has been an issue for us for a while, but definitely it's on the front burner for us, especially as it regards Wagera Barango, right? Because we share that. We share that. Welcome to Wachari Nation Building Monday Live.
Sereme, Sereme, Gunda na Lugera la na Fariha in the Subudi. I'm happy to be able to share my knowledge, my insights. I would just like to make a slight correction. You refer to the 150 Garinagu who were here in 1802. And that is from writings that we find in the archives of British Honduras. No? Now, I would like to also reflect on that a little bit. The arrival in Ratan was in 1797. Imagine that by 1802, 5 years later, there were approximately 150 people, Garinagu, who had found their way to the settlement. They came on their own, they were not brought. I should mention too that at first the settlers wanted them to come because at the time they were expecting an invasion by the Spaniards, and they were aware of the military prowess of the Garifuna. And there were instructions given that uniforms be set aside with the expectation that the Garifuna would come, these warriors, these fighting men, would come and sell their labor as mercenaries to assist in the defense of the settlement. Of course, our ancestors didn't do that. They were busy settling, seeing about their livelihood. After all, when they arrived in Ratan, you couldn't expect them to make plantation because it was 12th of April. So they had to look for ways and means to survive. But selling their labor as mercenaries was not one of them. So they were not involved in the Battle of St. George's Key. But we have this quote from Cunningham Esquire, who complained in 1802 about the presence of these 150 people. And they were not really, while they were obviously open to taking on jobs that might be available, they were actually good seamen. We can imagine that they came in their own crafts, that by that time, 5 years later, they had made their own dories and come on their own. And one of the reasons for the complaints was that, according to this Mr. Cunningham, these people were manning sensitive posts like the lighthouses. And he was worried that that these free Black people would inspire rebellion among their slaves. So they were not really working in mahogany camps. Yet later on, Garinagu came and they worked in mahogany camps. But at that time, they were mostly out there at sea. And obviously they didn't just appoint themselves to man lighthouses. They were given these appointments, these jobs, because of their ability. Go Hawara, go Hongo Barana. No?
Mm-hmm. I this is the I'm wondering if maybe there will be the necessity for us to engage in a rewriting of Garifuna history so that any of the misinformation that might currently exist in the various accounts of our arrival, that those could be corrected once and for all. That I would say, because I think it's important for people to know our story from us and
Mm-hmm.
in an accurate way, because even among us there's so many Garinago who don't know the story very well, and that's why I really appreciate these kinds of discussions, because it gives our people an opportunity to hear our history and hopefully to learn it so that they too can share it with the next generation. And it's the one story, that's a true story of us, from us, by us. I don't know
If
your
I may,
thoughts on
if I may, I don't think that we have been taught Garifuna history in our schools. What we are given are data, facts. For instance, we are told that, and from the point of view of, if facts can be presented from a point of view, we are not given the story, we are given information. And I became very much aware of this when we were working on giving meaning to the Chilihadwa Garinago monument. It was my job, working along with Dr. Aranda. It was my job, my task, to interpret what we meant by the arrival, survival, and prosperity of the Garifuna people. What the monument really meant. And to do that, I had to reflect a lot on the information that was available so that I could talk to teachers. We had some sessions with teachers, and we had some sessions on the radio at the time. And what I realized was that we were given information, we were given dots, but the dots were never connected. We were never assisted to connect the dots. For instance, we were told that the Garifuna arrived in 1832. It was not until we read the sources, the original sources, that we came to realize that, hey, wait, there were at least 150 people, Garinagu, in the settlement north of the Sibun, by 1802. And then we realized also that 1832, the supposed date for the founding of Dangriga, was not true. Thomas Vincent Ramos spoke about 1823. And we know that the superintendent that was involved at the time was Superintendent Codd. And by 1832, Superintendent Codd was no longer here. So it places 1823 as a date where there was this first mass migration. Mm-hmm. People came individually. By 1802, we know that there were at least 150. I'm sure that others came, but the significance of 1823 is that it was the first mass migration where they came to make a community, and they did that at the mouth of the North Sand Creek River. I think it is also important to speak about how we spread, how the Garifuna people dispersed. They were offloaded in Ratan. Some food, some supplies were left, but much of those supplies had suffered water damage. And so they had to survive the best way they could. So that by September of 1797, most of them had found their way to the mainland. The British had intended that they would settle in Roatan. I don't know if people are generally aware that 25 years before the exile actually happened, it was suggested. I read that in the writings of Nancy Gonzalez, and I recently read a book by Winserling, The Making of British Honduras, where he actually quoted that section of a letter where this Earl of whatever was suggesting 25 years, almost to the date, that the British would never be fully in control of the island, of the lands in the island, unless they got rid of those people. And the suggestion was to move them to some place on the coast of Africa, care being taken to give them enough supplies to subsist. And it happened 25 years later. So it was something premeditated, no? Mm-hmm. So the idea was to establish a settlement for them to take them to this place, they stay there, and they settle there. And that would have given them, because the British had an interest in Roatan, that would have given them a foothold, a stronger footprint. And that is why the Spaniards, the Spanish authorities, resisted, pushed back. And so that there's an entry in Borden's Archives of British Honduras where the instructions were given that the uniforms that had been set aside for the Caribs be given to the slaves who would participate in the defense of the settlement in what became the Battle of St. George's Key. And they said to give those uniforms to the slaves because the Caribs had defected to the Spanish. Those are the exact words, defected to the Spanish in Trujillo. So when you look at it from our perspective, what did our people do? Most of them decided, we can't make it here on this island. Let us make it to the mainland. Mm-hmm. So according to Nancy Gonzalez, by her research, by September, only a few were left on Roatan, and the migration began. It's important to understand that there were 3 migration routes, 2 main ones. One, where they spread from along the coast to the north, towards Guatemala, towards Livingston. Mm-hmm. Another one, simultaneously, where they crossed over to the settlement at the mouth of the Belize River, where they were not exactly welcome. And so whether they asked for permission or not, the fact is that they established a settlement south of the Sibun River. That is why all of our Garifuna communities are located south of the Sibun. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't say that we spread that the Garifuna people spread to Sarsoon. What we should say is that simultaneously there was the migration towards Guatemala, and those migration routes met very early on in a triangle that is composed of Livingston, Punta Gorda, and Barranco. So that Barranco is the tip of the triangle. Because Barranco was fed by the 2 migration routes. Like my Cayetano ancestors came down from Trujillo towards Livingston. Mm-hmm. Those are the descendants of my ancestor Juan Pedro Cayetano, who was born in 1804, which means he was born 7 years after the exile. First generation Garifuna in Central America. Mm-hmm. By 1844, a son of his was being baptized in Livingston. And our Palacio ancestors, yours and mine, came from the other migration route to the settlement at the mouth of the Belize River and down to Dangriga, and southwards, Jonathan Point, Punta Negra, Punta Gorda, because Barranco was settled from Livingston and Punta Gorda. Punta Gorda, Santiago Aviles was from Punta Gorda. He had come down from Trujillo. And but there were those who joined him from Livingston, including some children and grandchildren of my ancestor, Juan Pedro Cayetano. So it is important to understand those movements. And I would also say that where the Garifuna is concerned, the Sarsoon was not even a dividing line, because people from Livingston occupied, had farms in Sarsoon. People from Punta Gorda farmed Sarsoon. The story of Barranco, in the story of Barranco, we learned that Santiago Aviles, the founder, his sons, he had some sons who were born in Punta Gorda who resented his having a relationship with Magagide, the mother of Barranco. And they had a farm in the Sarsoon. And the story is that they would bypass Barranco, they would never land in Barranco. They would sail from Punta Gorda to Sarsoon to their farm. And it was because of a storm that erupted at some point that they were forced, on one occasion, they were forced to land in Barranco, and that is when they reconciled with their father. And my point is that there were people from Punta Gorda farming Sarsoon, and there were people from Livingston also farming that area. So the Sarsoon was not a dividing line where the Garifuna people were concerned. It was, we were one people, a trans-border people. We are all relatives, and we occupy the same area. People from Punta Gorda farmed up the Mojo River. People from Punta Gorda went beyond Barranco and farmed Timash, not just Mojo River, but Timash and Sarsoon. So we have footprints in those areas. I have some land on the Mojo River, and on that land I found some traces of Garifuna people, and this would be close to Santa Ana, San Felipe actually. I found some lemuru. Lemuru is a medicinal plant that we plant around our house or around our camps. I don't know if other people in Belize would do that, you know? And so that when you find a patch of lemuru in a place that is not occupied, it tells you something about the history of that land.
This is a very rich discussion. I want to ask you a question before we continue from one of our viewers about the 150 that came initially and the way it's been written, both in Jeremy Enriquez's writings as well as in Assad Schumann's writings, talk about the 150 coming as laborers in mahogany camps, which is a bit different from what you just shared. And so the viewer is asking about some clarification about these two different accounts in relation to the 150 Garinagu that have been mentioned in different accounts of our history.
All right, if you search the my source is Borden's Archives of British Honduras.
Okay.
If you have access to Borden's Archives of British Honduras, there are 3 volumes. And you look for, these were synopses of official letters, of official documents. If you look for, and they're in chronological order, if you look for 1802, you will find that entry where this something Cunningham Esquire wrote to the magistrates complaining about the presence of these people in the settlement. And he referred specifically in that quotation, and this was a quotation, he was not paraphrasing because it was in inverted commas, that to the fact that some of these people were manning sensitive posts, including lighthouses. He specified that. No, I am not saying that there weren't some among those 150 who ended up in the mahogany camps. Some probably did that because they were looking for work.
Yes.
They were thinking about livelihoods. Yeah, they were dumped on this island, and they had to make a living. We remember that there was no UNHCR in those days. Mm-hmm. There were no international agencies that looked after migrants. So that they had to survive as best they could. And I should also mention that the fact that they came in their own canoes is significant for 2 reasons. They came, they were not brought.
Yes.
That's one. It indicates that they had wrecked the area, if you will. They were excellent seamen. They had made their own crafts and were able to, and they had surveyed the area and came on their own steam. That is awesome. It tells us how good they were at seafaring. Mm-hmm. They could take care of themselves in the sea, and they knew how to make the crafts. Another point is that there is also where we always hear about Garifuna people being given 48 hours or 72 hours, whatever the number of hours was, to quit the settlement within that space of time if they did not have permission from the superintendent. And in that same quotation, there's reference to the fact that they be sent out in their own crafts. What is that telling us? That is telling us that they had their own crafts. There were no passenger ships operating between the settlement at the mouth of the Belize River and Guatemala and Honduras. They came in their own crafts, no? Mm-hmm. Yes, like I said, I am not saying that some of those 150 and the others who came after that did not work in the mahogany camps but Mr. Cunningham was complaining about that quotation is very interesting. If you haven't seen it, you should look it up.
Yes, I will.
I can supply it to you. We have it in the museum, the Gulisi Museum, because we believe it is significant. He said that these people are dangerous. We can't have them here. Because according to him, to paraphrase, when they, especially when the minds of our best people are influenced by liquor, that these these people, the Caribs, would influence them to, in effect, an insurrection, to bring about an insurrection. In other words, they were concerned about that these free non-white people in the settlement were a bad example. And so we better get rid of them. Otherwise, they will spoil our servants. And it is also significant, and I heard this from the work of Assad Schumann and Nigel Boland, that one of the reasons they were considered dangerous was not just because of what they had heard about what happened in St. Vincent. That is not the reason. After all, remember that they wanted us to join them in the Battle of St. George's Key. And they'd given instructions for uniforms to be set aside for the Caribs, who they hoped would offer themselves as mercenaries. So at first they wanted us, and afterwards they considered us dangerous. It was afterwards that they considered us dangerous. Why? Dangerous because the impact that we would have on their property. In those days, remember that they came in their own crafts. In those days, and the Garifuna and the slaves, they gravitated towards each other at first, and they saw themselves as brothers, friends. And so the Garifuna were helping some of the slaves to escape, because once they got to the Central American Republic, they were free. And so the settlers, the masters, were losing property because of the activities of the guerrilla. That is why they were considered dangerous.
I found the quote, our comrade has it in A History of Belize in 13 chapters.
Good. Read it so that our
says, he makes reference to this letter by the settler. He didn't name the settler, but this was in December 1802.
Right.
Warning of the danger of the presence of the Caribs in the settlement, stating that everyone is aware of the quote, atrocities committed by them in Grenada, St. Vincent, etc. And that with Christmas approaching, when the brains of the best servants will be inflamed with liquor, the danger of an insurrection led by these people will be considerable. End quote.
You see what power we were seen to have and why they were afraid of us?
Yeah.
And it's important you were not taught that in school, were you?
No, I was not. Not until I started to teach Belizean history, and even when I learned it and learned it from this text, that is when I became aware of that.
Right.
And that's why I love discussing history, because when it comes to any fight that we will take on now, we need to know the many fights that we have fought before now, and how we were viewed and how we were treated and what we overcame from then to now. I think that is imperative for our people to understand, and what it is when we celebrate, what it is we have to celebrate, the things that our ancestors did and accomplished, despite the efforts that were made against us as a people. So I really love discussing our history, because even when we have been, there've been all this propaganda against us to separate the same, remember we saw, as you rightfully said, saw each other as brothers and sisters, comrades, and the British saw that unity as a threat and made a conscious effort to separate these two groups. So in that propaganda campaign against us, even our history was distorted, and pride in our identity also became problematic for a lot of Garinagu, because then they don't know all that is us, all that is great and grand about us is unknown to them, because as also you rightfully mentioned, our history has not been taught to us. And that's why it's imperative for us to seek it out, to seek out our story and rewrite the accounts that have been, because you see, when you look at even the documentation that you refer to, somebody else will not take that information in the same way that we have taken that information. They will not appreciate that information in the same way that we appreciate that information, which is why we need to be the ones writing our story. Because even the words that we then use when we talk about our experiences will be very different. And your discussion, your sharing about our migration patterns between Honduras and the rest of Central America essentially is also very significant. I appreciate the correction and the clarification that our spreading or our settlement of southern Belize came from multiple angles. It was not that we went to Belize town and then spread from there to the south. It was that we were migrating this whole time, that whole, I mean, long before we were already, I dare say there were probably Garina who already, if not settled, at least setting up camps and occupying and utilizing southern Belize even before that formal arrival of the 150 in 1802. If we then would study the patterns as you have described them. So that is good for us to know. And again, to celebrate our navigational skills, that we were able to create our own vessels and then navigate those waters safely and expertly, so that we could be just traversing this coast with ease, you know, constantly, regularly. That is something good for us to know and to be proud of as a people. It's not just our music and our dance that we have to be proud of, not just our language, but our skills. We were
Remember,
very, very talented as a people.
remember the saying that if the history was written by the lion as opposed to the hunter.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
So
Exactly.
and you, this makes me think about how we have been duped by the education system, in terms as it relates to the content of education. The content of education was determined, well, has its roots in the colonial days. The purpose of education was originally schooling, when it was first introduced into this country, was for the children of the settlers. And the purpose of education, schooling, was resettlement. So they could, the children of the settlers, because they were not interested in this being home, for the most part, especially the ones who went to school. Mm-hmm. The idea was that they would be able to, when they returned to the mother country, that they would be able to land on their feet running, so that the schooling needed to prepare them for repatriation. Later, when the benefits of schooling was extended, access to schooling was extended to the children of the natives, there wasn't a reorientation. And I would go as far as to say that even after independence, there hasn't been a significant retooling, reworking of the orientation of education. And that is why our languages are not taught. We learn English, even though we don't speak English at home, we don't hear it in the streets, but we learn it. There's a focus on that. Our native languages are not taught. Our histories are not taught. And to the extent that something is a caricature of Garifuna history or Maya history or whatever is taught, it is just some facts, selected facts from the point of view of the settlers, from the point of view of the colonial masters. And we are not taught to connect the dots, like I said earlier. For instance, I had to discover 1802 myself. When I was at university, I had access to old books, including Borden's archives. That's when I found it. And that's when I started saying, you know, we are already here in 1802, so we'll take that as our date and we'll count from there. Mm-hmm. We were taught that 1832 was when Dangriga was established. And some of our own Garifuna scholars repeat that. We are told that the border treaty was with Guatemala was in 1859. We are told that colonial status was attained in 1862. We were given those dates, but there was never an attempt to connect the dots. What do those things mean? What do those events mean? So I had mentioned working on the monument to give it meaning. And that is when I started connecting those dots. I was a grown man. I had taught for years. I had worked in the Ministry of Education. But for the first time, I was looking at the data, as it were.
Yes.
And now let me analyze this. What does this mean? When our people in Honduras were fighting for land, my reaction was, well, we don't have a problem in Belize, because in Belize, we all have access like everybody else. You apply to the government for land, you develop it, and then you apply to purchase it. No problem. But then that is because of ignorance. I had not analyzed information. So in school, we were not taught that we had a pre-existing right to land. We were not taught that we were here before Belize, because what we were told, the narrative that we were given, was that we arrived in Trujillo, Roatan, sorry. We moved to the mainland and we spread along the coast to Honduras, to Guatemala, Belize, and Nicaragua. That was the narrative. What that meant was that those countries already existed, but the fact is that those countries did not exist yet.
Yep, they did.
So how can you go to Honduras when Honduras did not exist? How could you go to Guatemala and Guatemala did not exist? How could you come to Belize when Belize did not exist? And what existed was, and if, to the extent that Belize existed, the southern boundary was the Sibun.
Sibun, yeah.
And sure, the settlers were already doing things south of the Sibun, but it was without authority.
Yes.
It was not theirs. They were interloping. Mm-hmm. Hanani, you know, they didn't have rights. And one of the reasons why the Guatemalans, and also it should be mentioned that Isabel was sparsely populated. And so that Livingston was a big, as it were, a city, a cabecera, a major town where the development of Isabel is concerned. And it was a Garifuna community established, they say that as early as 1802, which gives you an idea of how fast the people spread.
Yes. 5 years. Just right. Just within 5 years.
Right. So, so we were not taught these things. We were given a narrative. And the sad thing is that when we talk about, it's one of the tragedies that arose from something that we probably otherwise would have been proud of, that we educated this country, that Garifuna teachers educated this country. But that too is something that we need to look at very, very seriously because of the impact, the negative impact that it had on us. I know about it. My father was a teacher and he taught in the extreme south of the country, taught in the extreme north of the country, in Mullins River. And the family moved with him. I taught in San Narciso up north. I taught in San Antonio, Toledo, San Pedro, Colombia, as well as St. Joseph in Belize City. Here I'm talking primary school. And when we went to these communities to teach, we did not go as Garifuna men or Garifuna young men. We did not go as representatives of our culture. We went as agents of the church and the colonial establishment. So we did not teach them about ourselves and our culture. What we taught was predetermined. We were servants of colonialism. Mm-hmm. But because these teachers were our brightest and our best from our communities, the cream of the crop, we lost two ways. One, because these are the people who would have led the development of our communities. Mm-hmm. One. And two, because they were the brightest and the best, and they were inevitably impacted by their experience. They were changed by their experience. When they went home to Barranco or St. Bite, they went back every time a little bit changed. People looked up to them. They wanted to be like them. And so when you look at the erosion that has taken place in our culture, language, culture, and so on, it is because of that. When you look at the shift from our relationship with the land to wage labor, yes, it's because of that. It's good to have money. It's not good to farm, because if you farm, that's kind of hard work, that's dirty. You better go to school so that you can get a job. And otherwise you'll have to work hard.
Yes.
The implication is
as if hard work is a bad thing.
You see? So, and all of this, I believe, is relevant to our discussion about land. Mm-hmm. Because if you look at Barranco, for instance, some might want to say, why do Barranco want all of that land? There are only a few people there. But they don't know the truth. Yep. Two things in response to that. If we are not farming as much as we used to, it is because of what was done to us. Yes. Policies. And I can mention two specifically. One is the change in the school holidays that had a negative impact on us. And in the case of Barranco and Punta Gorda as well, when the government stopped taking BG79 rice, and there was no assistance to shift to the other varieties. there are other government policies that have impacted us negatively. And because of that, people left. But they're still Baranguna because they still identify with Barranco. That's one of the things about Garifuna that we do not forget, no matter how far we go. We still, for God's sake, we're still talking about St. Vincent. We're still talking about Urume.
Yes.
It's been 224 years and we still look wistfully at Urume.
Yes.
So if we are doing that, think about the young man who might have left Barranco or St. Bite or Jadson, I believe the Lisurnia to go Wachari. How much more would he not be thinking about St. Bite and Barranco and Jadson and Hopkins, Dangriga and so on? It's in our...
It's in our DNA. And why not have it to go back to? Because we did not destroy it.
And that is the point. We want it there for us. Because we want to be able to, it's our resource, and we want to be able to utilize it. Because you see, when we had Wargo Barango, we had two. The last one I think was 2001, somewhere around there. 97. And there was a daradu between a covenant between the people who are resident in the village and those in Lisurnia, Lisurnia Maya. And the thing about us too is that when we leave our home, our place of birth, we don't just leave. We still have a connection there.
Yes.
That's why we talk about Anuhi Naribiri Nye, my navel string is there. You have Joe Tom's song, Me se me habadina luare yugadama nihi nugudarigi nye hebenari na gubrigo ayahi niduhi atulunuba nadinuba lohene nuburugute. And we have it recorded in song, this feeling about our connection, right? Yeah. So we don't, and this contrasts to some other people. For instance, to give an example of an extreme in the other direction. I was driving to Belize City from Belmopan one day, and I picked up a young man at the Guanacaste Park. They still had a Guanacaste tree there. And it turned out that he was from San Miguel. And so this young man had done time in the BDF, and now he was teaching. And so when I learned that he was from San Miguel, I said to him, so what's your father's name? He gave me his father's name. I said, oh, okay, and your grandmother, what's your grandmother's name, your father's mother? And he told me that he didn't know. I said to him, your grandmother's name is Rosa Dot. I gave him his grandmother's name. I knew his grandmother. I remembered her well. I remember one of the feature things I remembered about her is that she had a dislocated wrist. I knew the woman. Here was how in the Garifuna culture, how can you not know your grandmother's name, for God's sake? I can tell you about Juan Pedro Cayetano, who was born in 1804, because I'm interested. I want to know, you know, and we are like that. So well, my father taught in Santa Teresa when the people moved to San Miguel. Everybody was supposed to move to San Miguel, and the Santa Teresa was to be abandoned. Maybe one or two stubborn families remained, but everybody else moved. They erased those who moved to San Miguel. Once they had settled in San Miguel, forgot about Santa Teresa. Can you imagine that happening in Haragarinago?
It's
No,
not our way. That is not our way.
I have a relation. I think about, I'm living here in Dangriga, but you can't take Barranco out of me.
Mhm.
And not only Barranco, the whole route that Juan Pedro Cayetano traveled from Trujillo to Livingston to Barranco, the route that Santiago Aviles followed, that Teodoro Palacio and Anastasio Palacio, with stops in Jonathan Point. Jonathan Point does not exist as a Garifuna village anymore, but it's important to me because my ancestors lived there, and it was from there that they moved south. Punta Negra, Punta Gorda, Barranco. You know, so that those routes are important to us. And points on those routes are important to us because they're a part of our history.
Mm-hmm.
So that, to go back to that example, so that Santa Teresa was occupied by a totally different set of people. And so it's a different Santa Teresa
Than how it originally began.
from the Santa Teresa that people left to form San Miguel.
Mm-hmm.
And from San Miguel, the same founder, Francisco Scholl, led some people to start Laguna. And they forgot, those who moved to Laguna forgot totally about San Miguel. You know, you see the difference.
Yes.
So we are tied to the land, we are tied to spots, our history, our culture. We can't forget, we remember. We go all the way back to Urume, to St. Vincent,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and points along the way, points in time, points in space along the way are significant to us. So we are tied to the land.
Very much so. And I think for a lot of Euromena, it's surprising to hear our songs of Urume, and they would ask, so have you been to St. Vincent? I remember that when I was studying in Jamaica and interacted with Euromena and partnered with them for an event called Let's Talk Garifuna. And so they were hearing, I was teaching them the songs that I knew that we sung all the time in celebration and reverence to Yurume. And they were like, so have you been back to Yurume? And I had not been to Yurume at all, but our songs about Yurume are so strong, and they connect. And it's not only Garinagu in Belize that sing about Yurume, but Garinagu from everywhere that Garinagu are sing about Yurume, even if we and think of the composers of those songs who only could dream of going back to Yurume, but their songs were still so powerfully connecting us back to that place. So in those songs, we could not forget Yurume. Just like every other place, it is part of who we are. It is part of our identity to be and remain connected to the lands that our ancestors occupied.
When you think about our celebration of Yurume, our celebration of the 19th November, as well as celebration of 12th of April, the arrival, it entails a reenactment, right? And we call it Yurume. When you think about our spiritual observances, particularly the Dugu, we have a Dugahani, where, and you can see the similarity between a Dugahani and the Yurume. Mm-hmm. In the Dugahani, we look wistfully to Seri and we welcome the Ahari, that as we invite them to join us in the celebration.
Yes.
And similar to the what we call Yurume, the reenactment of their arrival. We look to Yurume and reenact our arrival because it's very, very significant. And both activities are carried out in actually the same way. So we looked across time. We looked through time to way back there because the exile from Yurume was our exodus.
Mm-hmm.
You know, similar when you read about the exodus in the Bible, the escape from Egypt, from bondage. It is up to us to frame it in a way that will give pride to our children. And in the same way that the Jews claim that they were able to survive because of the hand of God, in the same way that the Jews claim that they are God's chosen people, we have every reason. There's absolutely no reason why we can't do that as well.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why the Jews remain strong in spite of their dispersal is because they remember the story, they know the story, they tell and retell and retell and retell the story every there are occasions when that is a part of their observance. They have to do that. So we need to do that as well.
And we have 3 opportunities.
We do it, and we need to look for more opportunities so that we can pass this knowledge on to our children and give them pride.
Yes. Well, Baba Roy, our hour has quickly expired. I would like to ask for us to continue this discussion next Monday, because it's such a powerful discussion, and your sharing is extremely important. More and more of us need to know our history, know it the same way, and repeat it every day if possible, especially for our younger generation, for us to feel that pride, and for the younger generation to feel that as well, to be empowered by all that we have experienced and all that we have achieved as a people. And so I want to say, Sereme, to you for your sharing, and ask for you to come back next week to continue this very meaningful discussion on our history as a people, but also our history of land usage, because land, I really appreciate that particular thing that you shared, how connected we are to our land, that we may move far away from it, but we don't abandon it, and we certainly do not forget nor disconnect from it. And I would like us to continue our discussion from that same point next live.
I welcome every opportunity to share. I'm older than most people. I've seen more than a lot of people have seen. And I'm fortunate that I have been the beneficiary of certain experiences that result in my thinking that I've been very, very fortunate. And there are some things that I've been able to observe even as a child that the average person perhaps didn't have the opportunity. For instance, when I talked to you about Santa Teresa and San Miguel, I live those. When I talked to you, I live those movements. I observe those movements. And I've been observing from the time I was like 8 years old. Fortunately also, we would go home to Barranco. I was a teacher's son, so I experienced that. I know about that. I was a teacher myself. So I've been able to analyze those experiences. I'm fortunate to have studied anthropology in addition to linguistics. So that gives me the tool. And also in my study of Garifuna spirituality, Garifuna culture, I've been blessed that I can say that I'm the perfect participant observer, in that unlike some white person who comes from some university to study, when you see him in a Daboeba, you know that he's studying. When you see him in our community, you know that he's studying. But I'm able to be invisible, which means that my laboratory is not contaminated.
Yes.
That's why I refer to myself as the perfect participant observer where Garifuna culture, different aspects of Garifuna culture is concerned. And there's a lot to share, and I welcome every opportunity to do that.
Sarame Babaroy, and Sarame to our viewers. We will definitely continue this very rich discussion next week, Monday, at the same time, 7:30. So make sure you tune in so you can hear more of our very rich, very powerful, very meaningful history as Garinagu, and particularly how important land and therefore our rights to our land, how important that is to us as a people. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Ayo, ayo.
Ayo.